Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Henny. Yeah, I'll be covering wheat and barley. Phil will come in and cover oilseed rape. Just to give you a potted history, this was actually started on wheat back in 1993. So it's been running for just over 30 years now. Project report 166, if you're interested. It can be found on the excellent AHDB website. I'll get that back in there for you. Since then, I mean, it started just by looking at septoria and yellow rust, and since then it's expanded to look at other diseases on wheat, but also look at diseases on barley and oilseed rape. And I think in the last 2 decades, it's quite continuously provided UK-wide independent information on product efficacy. And I think it's actually the envy of Europe. If you talk to European agronomists and pathologists, they really value this. The sole aim really is to provide you, the growers and agronomists, with sound, independent information to get the best out of new and existing chemistry. So, you know, if you don't think we're doing that, please let me know. We were keen to change, to adjust if we can. The methodology in the last 10 years hasn't changed much. However, some people in this room may be looking at this for the first time. So for those of you that are perhaps a little longer in the tooth and that have seen this presented before, this is your opportunity for a quick nod before we get into the data. But I will start by sharing some of the background. What do we do and why do we do it? Well, each year we choose high-risk locations for the target disease, highly susceptible varieties, and spray just once, either at a quarter, half, full, and double label rate to give us a dose response. That dose response gives us a response both across leaf layers, but also across sites and across seasons to give us a really robust indication as to how products compare and how they perform. We do also sometimes apply cover sprays where, for example, the target is septoria. We might use azoxystrobin to control rusts so that we're looking at one disease at a time. We think that's quite important. Otherwise, it's quite a mixed message that we get out the trial. We do separate some of the data into protectant and eradicant as well. That just gives us a different level of information. How do we do that? Well, this example just talks you through it. If we spray leaf 2 in a trial, we would consider leaf 2, because it's just emerged, to be in a protectant situation. That, as well as leaf 1 that's just emerging at that time, we would consider those 2 leaves to be protectant. Leaf 3 and 4, following a leaf 2 application, will have been emerged for some time. And these varieties are quite susceptible in high-risk locations. There's a very good chance there'll be some latent infection on those lower leaves. So we do classify those lower leaves as eradicant. There's 1 or 2 exceptions, but I'll not go into that. As a broad brush approach, that's what we do. We have a number of sites on wheat. We do have definitely a focus on septoria. It's the biggest problem we have. And it's also quite variable in trials, so it's good to get an average across a number of sites. So there's 7 sites looking at septoria each year, 1 on yellow rust, 1 on brown rust, and 1 on fusarium. Although, unfortunately, I won't have much to say about fusarium this year. It just didn't manage to get the disease this season. The challenge of doing inoculated work in 26-degree temperatures in direct sunshine eluded us. But we're not moving on. There we are. We are now. I included this just to give a point of reference to you. We will be going through and talking about a lot of product names in a moment. The product names are all down the left-hand side of this. And there are a whole host of different combinations of actives within that. I'm not going to talk through all of them. If you want to take a picture on your phone so that you've got a reference as we go through if you're not sure what they all are. Suffice to say, we are testing a range of azoles, DMIs, STHIs, 1 QII, infendic oxamid, some strobilurins, and some mixtures of the 2. Additional to that, that's the products that are registered that we'll be showing information on. Each year we do also test some products that are not registered, so that when they are registered, we can come out with some new information. And we do actually we've been testing 5 over the last year. We have actually had 1 emerge. Jessico Fusion, we've been testing now for 2 years, and that was registered a few weeks ago. So we will be sharing some information on that. That's actually a mixture. I'll come on to what it is now. Jessico Fusion is a fungicide that's registered for the use in wheat, triticale, rye, and spelt, for the control of septoria, yellow rust, and brown rust. In a litre of Jessico Fusion, it has 50 grams of fenpicoxamid and 35.5 grams of isoflurane. And at a full label rate of 1.5, that equates to around about a 75% dose of fenpicoxamid and a 71% dose of isoflurane. So it's quite a loaded product, not quite like the Anobis and Brutuses of the world back then, but perhaps certainly a bit more than half plus a half. You can only use it once. Just to share with you the challenge we had in doing septoria trials last year. Septoria is a pathogen that loves moisture and rainfall. And this just shows the rainfall anomaly charts from the Met Office through March, April, May, and June last year. Brown shaded areas indicating the areas that were less than average rainfall, and blue areas where it was above average. And you can see quite consistently from March to June, in some parts of the country, it was brown, well below average. In some parts, very, very much below average. One question we sometimes get asked about this project is why we don't test our fungicides on conventional, more resistant varieties further east. If we had this year, we would have no data. And I'd like to think actually that, okay, we're testing in more extreme environments, highly susceptible varieties. Actually, a susceptible variety in a low-pressure year is probably quite akin to a moderately susceptible or more resistant variety in a high-pressure season. So we can still usefully get information out of these trials, even when we've had a low-pressure season. And that's really valuable. It means we can continue to share valuable information. What did we get this year? Well, the septoria data is a little thinner than it sometimes is, but we still managed to get 4 sites give us good protectant information and 3 give us good curative information, or eradicant information. And that's been enough to get a good average from those trials. I was wondering how the colours were going to come out. Not too badly, actually, thankfully. This just is the first of the graphs I'm going to share with you. There will be a few. This is the septoria protectant data from 2025. On the right-hand side of that chart, you've got the products with a single active ingredient. On the left-hand side, you have the mixtures. It's the same data set. You can look across from left to right. If you're wondering why we separate them, it's just so that you can see the lines. Once you get 5 or 6 lines on a graph like this, it becomes a bowl of spaghetti. You can't see what you're looking at. Looking at the efficacy that we saw, though, Miravis Plus, the pidiflumethafen, SDHI, very, very active on the left-hand side. You can see at quite low rates, that blue line is giving us quite a good level of control. Pectiga, fenpicoxamid in green, also looking very good. And quite similar to that, we were seeing Myrisa and Vimoy. Quite hard to separate those based on the efficacy data we're seeing there. You'll note there's also a light blue and a luminous orange dot on their own around the 100% dose. That is actually Proline and Arizona. We've been testing those just at a full label rate. It's a benchmark for the activity we see from prothioconazole. Prothioconazole is still widely used, so it's useful to know what it's still bringing. And Arizona at a full label rate. It's useful to just get an idea of how protectant the situation is and what that can bring us. So we don't do a full dose response. That's just an efficiency, so allow us to test other things. On the left-hand side, you can see the mixtures. These 2 mixtures that we were testing this year that we can share. One is Univoc, the other is Jessico Fusion. So both of those contain fenpicoxamid, Univoc with Proline or prothioconazole, Jessico Fusion with isoflurane, and actually both performing very, very well in a protectant environment last year. That's the curative data now. Note, when we look at curative data, these are not absolute values. Sometimes we're looking at leaves well below the sprayed leaf, and that could often be a level of disease that's beyond control on those low leaves. These trials are trying to pull out differences between products rather than determine whether we're getting 60, 70, or 80% control. So please don't look at the fact that, yes, actually the line's quite high. That doesn't actually mean much at all. It just means some of the lower leaves were included. In terms of differences, which is what we're about, Miravis and Pectiga actually performing very similarly. So that's the fenpicoxamid and pidiflumetamide, dose for dose. Very hard to separate on what we saw last year. And Myrisa and Vimoy also providing a good level of control, but perhaps not quite at the same level of activity as we're seeing from those other two. And over on the left, Univoc and Jessico Fusion. Again, the points touching the lines from each other, I think you probably struggle to separate them on that information, but both performing very well. Now, the yields from these trials are a tough test. This isn't the same as a yield response that you'd have in a program as you might have on a farm. This is a single spray, and then the treatment is allowed to run. There's no cover sprays that follow to control that pathogen that follow it. So in some cases, it's a T1 trial that's just left to run. So it really does test the persistence of products, how well they hold on and continue to control disease. And clearly, actually, Miravis comes out quite well there. Quite hard to separate, probably, the other three in Pectiga, Myrisa and Vimoy, all performing quite similarly there. And again, actually, the mixtures, Jessico Fusion, Univoc, giving a very good level of control and a good yield response. So that's the 2025 data. Well, I'll give the over-year septoria data before we move on to look at rusts. So over 3 years now, the curves always look better over 3 years. You've got more points, and they tend to average out. And we tend to get a little bit more separation, and we do see a little bit of that here. Clearly, Miravis, the lowest line on the right-hand side chart there, looking very strong. Pectiga, perhaps not far from that, but not quite as active as Miravis. I think we are seeing a bit of separation there. And actually, Myrisa and Vimoy overlying each other, all providing a good level of control, but a little bit of separation between them in terms of activity. On the left-hand side, you can see the mixtures. And actually, because we're looking at 3 years now, when we had Ipresso, which is an isoflucipram proline mix, in there for the first two of those 3 years, we can now include that in. And yeah, it's perhaps no surprise that the two mixtures containing fenpicoxamid look as good as they do, because fenpicoxamid, as you can see on the right-hand side, is very active. Ipresso, quite similar to what we might expect from Vimoy plus prothioconazole. It's reflecting the slightly lower activity that we're seeing from Vimoy compared to fenpicoxamid. When we look at the eradicant data, a similar sort of picture to what we saw in 2025, actually. Clearly, Miravis and Pectiga performing very similarly in curative environment, and Myrisa and Vimoy just a small step behind that in terms of efficacy. And again, those two fenpicoxamid mixtures on the left-hand side, the Jessico Fusion with isoflucipram and the Prothio fenpicoxamid Univoc there, both doing a very good job also. When we look at yields across that, this is what we find. Miravis does stand out. It clearly is a very, very active molecule on septoria and provides a very robust yield response. Pectiga, second to that. And yes, Myrisa and Vimoy also giving us a good yield response, but not quite as strong as the other two. Again, I think I'd struggle to separate Jessico Fusion and Univoc based on that information. Ipresso, a small step behind based on the efficacy of isoflucipram versus the fenpicoxamid, I think. So moving on to have a quick look at yellow and brown rust. These have both been a problem in the last couple of years, so particular interest in this season. Starting with yellow rust, Proline works really well on yellow rust, always has. We always used to dismiss it because it wasn't quite as good as epoxy back in the day. But actually it always has, and it still underpins our treatments. So the light blue line on the right-hand side is a good benchmark. There are things out there that are a bit better. The STHIs, both Elatus and Vimoy were tested last year, both very, very active on yellow rust. I'll come on to Elatus on brown rust, but it still works very, very well on yellow rust. We included Amistar this year. That's the dotted green line just below Proline there. And that too was giving us a very good level of performance and quite a cost-effective way to help control yellow rust. Myrisa, I think compared to prothioconazole, it's not quite as active as Prothio on yellow rust. I think if you were looking at brown rust, it would be the other way around. But yeah, not quite as active on yellow. Looking at the mixtures, it's perhaps no surprise to see Plaxium there. Plaxium, of course, is a three-way mix of fluxapyrrole, I gotta get this right. Nick Duncan's in the room. Yeah, it's a prothioconazole, isoflucipram, and fluoroparam. And the isoflucipram and prothioconazole both have good activity on yellow rust. So it's no surprise that we're getting good activity from there. And the other two, well, Univoc contains proline, that's pretty good, and the Jessico Fusion isoflucipram. So both of those have one of their partners is strong on yellow rust. In terms of yields, actually, the yields from the yellow rust trials actually had proline right up there, doing really well. Elatis Plus tight behind that, the THIs, Vimoy as well, and Elatis Plus looking very good. Amistar not far behind. And again, we're seeing my research just reflecting the slightly lower inherent activity that we see from mefentrifluconazole versus the other. I think I'd struggle on the left-hand side to separate those, that they're probably all within the error that we see within that trial. Ooh. I'm not quite sure what's going on with that graph there. It looks absolutely fine here. Is there anything you can do over there, Stuart? That's what we've seen. Is it the next one? That's better. Okay, now we're going to talk through that for a moment. So moving on to look at brown rust. Quite a lot of actives we tested last year, and quite a few things working really well. Comet does a great job on brown rust, always has. Vimoy, Imtrex, those two SDHIs really active on brown rust as well. And actually Myrisa, very, very strong on brown rust as well. A couple of products performing perhaps less well, but then we would have known that Miravis and Pectiga weren't as active on brown rust, but they're really specialist septoria products. One slightly odd result in there is Toledo. I've looked into this a little because we've tested, Toledo is straight tebuconazole. It's an SC formulation, 340 grams, and quite a popular one. We included it this year because it was considered one of the more widely used of the 65 different tebuconazoles that are registered for use in wheat. And because we thought it'd be useful to see just how TEB performs. Where we've tested tebuconazole previously, we've tested it as Folicure. Folicure is a 250-gram EC formulation, emulsion rather than suspension concentrate. And I did look back, actually, to where we tested it in 2005 and 2006, and we had it in there versus Comet and Amistar. And it looked almost identical to Amistar and just a shade behind Comet. I think if you were to superimpose that graph onto this, I would have expected Folicure to be tight in there with Myrisa, Imtrex, and Vimoy. It would have been in that area, not quite as sharp as Comet perhaps, but at the full half-label rate it would have done as much. So why is Toledo up there? We need to be careful not to draw too many conclusions from one individual trial, because any individual trial can throw a curveball at you. But yeah, it does sort of beg the question as to whether the EC and SC formulations may affect the activity of tebuconazole. Looking at the left-hand side, Plaxium is likely to be very, very good. So those contain isoflucipram, so likely to be very, very good on brown rust, and they are. Looking over years now, we didn't have tebuconazole in the preceding years, unfortunately, but we did have Elatis for a couple of years before that. And note, I mean, Elatis, there has been a change in the SDHIs. This occurred last year, and we spoke at length about the I87F mutation that has occurred. It still accounts for, I think, around 50% of the population, and it is affecting some SDHIs. Not all. I think we've seen in the last chart that Imtrex and Vimoy is still performing very well on brown rust, but clearly it does affect Elatis Plus, and Elatis Plus doesn't look as active as it used to on brown rust. I think the rest fall pretty much, as we saw in the last chart, the Miravis and Pectiga, not quite as strong as the other chemistries, and yeah, the Apresso, Jessico Fusion, both containing isoflucipram, are looking very good. The yields from the brown rust trials, I've included this for completion more than anything else. There is an oddity in here in that in 2024, Imtrex gave us a 1.5 ton yield response over everything else, which we still can't understand or explain, but we can't ignore it either. So it's kind of skewing the data. I think the yield responses we're seeing to everything else broadly reflect the efficacy we've seen. So that was it from the fungicide performance data for 2025. I did want to just look now at septoria and how it's changing over time. And I'm going to start by showing a graph that many of you may have seen before, showing the decline that we saw, or have seen, with prothioconazole over time. Of course, prothioconazole, when it first came out back in the early 2000s, was fantastic, 80–90% control from full label rate in a protective environment. It gradually has declined over a period. It's now perhaps providing us with an unreliable level of control. It does vary from season to season and site to site. But on average, within these trials, the last 2 or 3 years, it's been giving us somewhere in the order of 40% control in a protectant situation. Mefentrifluconazole, the other azole, has now been out for 5 years or so. And interestingly, I mean, that does seem to be maintaining a difference and a higher level of efficacy compared to prothioconazole, which is reassuring. And in terms of the single-site products, when you look at them over time, I mean, this goes back to 2000, so it's showing the last 6 years. And clearly, you know, when we look at Miravis there, it was performing better in 2020 than it is now. But I think, really, we're struggling to see that there's been much of a change in field efficacy over the last 3 years. It's been pretty stable. Every season will affect the graph a little bit. I think in 2025, the graphs tend to flatten off after a 50% dose. I think that may reflect the lower pressure season that we had in 2025. But I think you'd probably struggle to say on that information that we've actually seen a change in field efficacy, which is good. But we have to be careful. We can't be complacent. Some of you will be old enough to remember what happened in the early 2000s, where we had the G143A mutation occur, which conferred complete insensitivity to all the strobilurins. The strobilurins, Amistar, Swift, they were fantastic on septoria back then, giving us 80–90% control, even 100% control in some trials. And they looked great. People were using them on their own, without any partners in some cases, which wasn't great. A mutation occurred. There was no fitness penalty for that mutation in the pathogen. And over the course of 2 or 3 years, we went from having a completely sensitive population to strobilurins to a completely insensitive, or pretty much insensitive population to them, and efficacy fell away very quickly. To guard against that, we are monitoring. We're looking in the field to see just what's going on. And it's actually thanks to Nicola Hawkins and a parallel project that she's running at NIAB that I'm going to share a little bit of information on resistance management and what she's finding from laboratory studies looking at this. So this is monitoring and understanding fungicide development in wheat, and looking particularly at septoria. And I'm not actually directly involved in this project, so I'll be sharing a summary, shall we say, rather than the in-depth report that Nicola would be able to give you. Just to give you a very brief overview of the aims, there's 2 things we're really measuring. We're measuring early season sampling, or early season disease, and that's sampling at Rothamsted, that looks to effectively just get septoria samples from the field and see how sensitive they are to azoles, QIIs, and SDHIs, and then put that onto a graph and see how it's changed over time. Really important to see how things are changing over a period of time. The second thing we're measuring, and this is perhaps a more recent addition, this is using samples from the fungicide performance. We're actually looking to see if we can select for insensitivity in the field in a season. So we're taking samples where certain treatments have been applied, like Pectiga, like Miravis, where they've been applied in the field, and seeing whether the sensitivity to Miravis and Pectiga and the other actives has changed as a result of that. So it's trying to see whether we can initiate a shift in the field, or whether that is occurring. And that's a really good indicator as to whether we're seeing the emergence of less sensitive isolates. And the way we can judge that is by comparing those to the untreated, because the untreated won't have had that selection pressure imposed. The last one there, looking at cross-resistance profiles and key resistant genotypes, that's ongoing work, and I'll let Nicola share that with you in due course, perhaps in the new year. Give an overview of the results. This is the azoles from the early season sampling. So this is where we're looking at across years. On the left-hand chart, you've got prothioconazole sensitivity. On the right-hand side, you've got mefentrifluconazole on Myrisa. They take a bit of getting your head around these charts, don't they? I should say, the starting point really is each point on here represents an individual isolate of septoria. Each line reflects an individual year. So if you focus on the right-hand chart there, and there's a blue line on the left-hand side of that chart that reflects 2003. That is the sensitivity profile we had for Proline in 2003. Over a period of years, that line has gradually shifted further and further to the right as the population has gradually become less and less sensitive to prothioconazole. And you can see on the very right-hand edge of that, you might just be able to see these some grey circles just to the right of those bright orange. That is actually the 2025 data. And that suggests actually the in vitro sampling that Nicola's done. If anything, prothioconazole is becoming a little bit less sensitive to azoles. The isolates are becoming a little bit less sensitive to prothioconazole. On the right-hand side, you can see mefentriliconazole. And actually, it's a tighter group, but then there's less years, so it would be. And actually, the 2025 data, you can just see it sits right in the middle of the pack. So her monitoring wouldn't actually suggest that the isolates have become any more sensitive to mefentri in the last year. Reassuring. Look at Pectiga, and this is what we see. And actually, the 2025 data for Pectiga sits almost identical to what we've seen in the last 2 years for Pectiga. Both in 2023 and 2024, it was a very similar level. I think there was a small shift from what we saw, perhaps even before it came out as a product, from sampling in 2022, and prior to that, the population might have been a little bit more sensitive. But generally, it's not shifting. It's in a pretty stable place. So again, quite reassuring. We look at the STHIs, and this is what we see for Bixafen and Miravis. We've actually moved on from looking at Bixafen and including Miravis, because that's the more active of the two. And I think clearly Bixafen's been out there for some time, and we've seen a gradual selection as more mutations have occurred for greater insensitivity to Bixafen over a period of time, to the point where now I think you can see there's a bit of a collection on the right-hand side of the left-hand side chart there that accounts for about 20 or 30% of the isolates that are really quite insensitive to Bixafen. Looking at Miravis, to be honest, I'm not sure you'd read too much into this. The line does jump around a bit from year to year. Actually, it's the 2022 line that's nearest to the right-hand side, nearest to the 2025 there. And actually, in the preceding 2 years, in 2024 and 2023, it looked to be the left of the 2022 line. It's perhaps the 2025 line slightly to the right of what we've seen before, but I think you'd probably say that's within the error that you might get within sampling. And yeah, not too concerned. So, not too concerned. Sampling done in February, March, prior to any sprays, seemed to indicate we're okay. Things are fairly stable. I'm now looking at late season sampling. So this is samples taken from the fungicide performance trials after certain treatments were applied. So I'm going to start by looking at mefentri, Myrisa. So this is from 5 sites, an average of 5 sites. I'm not sure what colour that is, orange, I think. The orange line reflects the untreated. So the line doesn't reflect a year now, it reflects a treatment. The untreated is in orange and the Myrisa is in green. And what's reassuring there is, following either no treatment at all or Myrisa, sensitivity to Myrisa seems to be about the same. It doesn't seem to have shifted as a result of that treatment. So that suggests the application of that treatment isn't driving resistance in those samples. So that's quite reassuring. When we look at Pectiga, again, the untreated and the Pectiga line almost on top of each other. So where we applied Pectiga in the field and where we did nothing and sampling, subsequently, the sensitivity to Pectiga stayed the same. That's quite good. No problems. Not quite the same with the STHIs. Now, this is where we've got a little bit more of a concern. This is sensitivity to Miravis following application in blue, Vimoy or Miravis in green. So this is looking at the sensitivity to the STHIs. The untreated is a bit to the left there, and Nicola has found there are some isolates in the top right-hand corner of that that are less sensitive to Miravis than we have previously seen before. We think there are some new combinations that are occurring. We don't know exactly how they will evolve. Sometimes there are fitness penalties when new mutations occur and new things emerge, and there may be fitness penalties, or there may not be. We don't know. But slightly concerning that we are seeing a small collection there. And when we look at sensitivity to Vimoy, following Miravis and Vimoy treatments, it's a similar picture. The untreated, quite clearly to the left-hand side, and actually where we've applied either Miravis or Vimoy, sensitivity to Vimoy does appear to have shifted a little bit. And again, there is a small collection of isolates in the top right-hand corner there, less than 20%, maybe 15% that do appear to be a little less sensitive to SDHIs than we have seen previously. Now, we haven't seen a change in field performance, but this is where we've applied SDHIs on their own, which isn't something farmers or agronomists will be advising or doing in the field. But it is a bit of a warning shot, I think, that we can select for insensitivity to SDHIs. It can occur. We do sometimes get asked if Vimoy and Miravis will respond similarly, and is there cross-resistance? And we think generally they will. Isolates that are sensitive to one will be sensitive to the other generally, and isolates that are less sensitive to one will generally be less sensitive to the other as well. So they're both SDHIs. It's no great surprise, that. But useful just to check. So just to sum up on that, the azoles, we have seen some gradual changes to azole sensitivity in vitro. I haven't shown any data on it, but there is incomplete cross-resistance, I think, between prothioconazole and triproconazole. I think there are some isolates out there that are insensitive to both, but there are also some that are sensitive to one and insensitive to the other. So we don't think it's ever using mixture or sequence of prothio and methane is never going to be as good as using two different AIs, but there may be some small benefit from a resistance management point of view of putting them in sequence or mixture. On the SDHIs, as we said, we do think that where solo SDHIs have been treated, we have seen further shifts, and that's a concern. The resistance does appear to be becoming more complicated and more double mutants, and new field mutations emerging. So, watch this space, I think, on that. We just need to avoid widespread widespread selection for these less sensitive types. And as we said, Miravis and Vimoy select similarly. QIIs, the fenpicoxamid seems to be still within that sensitive baseline range. So, forgive me for banging the drum once again on resistance management, but you can get the resistance management guidelines of the FRAC website. But in principle, what we're saying, and we think is really good to do, is to use mixtures and sequences of different modes of action. And on septoria, we think we should be including multi-sites as well, and avoid the repeat use of the same mode of action where possible. I think this will increase the effective life of these at-risk groups, which is really important for all of us. But I think it will also improve field efficacy. If we're seeing a shift in efficacy to a given mode of action in the field, if we're not using that given mode of action repeatedly, we'll get better efficacy from something else. So just to summarize the efficacy information on wheat, going back to the slides I shared earlier, on septoria, clearly Miravis Plus and Pectiga were very, very active. And actually, Jessico Fusion, in combination with fenpicoxamid and isoflucipram and Univoc, both containing fenpicoxamid, also very, very good on septoria. Vimoy and Myrisa also giving us useful activity, good activity there as well. On yellow rust, it was really products containing either prothioconazole, isoflucipram, or benzodiazepine. So that's the prolines, Vimoys, Maxims, Latus Pluses, Abyssal, Jessico Fusion. They really came out top. Amistar, though, clearly very good activity as well, and that's really useful. On brown rust, Comet came out really well there. I think you'd see almost the same activity from Azoxy. Imtrex as well, Vimoy, Myrisa, giving us very high level of brown rust control. And I think overall, the mixtures generally have offered us more robust disease control and higher yields than the straights, and I think that's where we need to be. So that was it on wheat. say a little bit on barley before handing over to Phil. On the barley, it's a shorter treatment list. We've been testing 3 azoles, 3 SDHIs, and 1 SDHI azole mixture. Again, though, there are 6 products we've been testing in 2025 that are not yet available, and as soon as they are, we will look to share that information with you. What did we get from 2025? It was a tough year to try and get barley disease in trials, but we did manage to get some rhynchosporium data, a little bit of net blotch and ramularia information. We actually got some really good powdery mildew information for a change, which was nice, and a little bit on brown rust, so a broader spread that we sometimes see. Looking at rhynchosporium, I actually think rhynchosporium is one of the easier pathogens to control at the moment. Proline continues to work really well on it. It's been around for a long time, but it's still very active on rhynchosporium and a very easy way of controlling it. There are other things that also have good activity, and clearly the SDHIs, miravis and vimoy, very, very active, and actually probably providing us a little bit more activity than we see from Proline. Myrisa, yeah, not quite as active on Rhyncho as Proline in a protectant situation. You know, there's one mixture on the left-hand side in Revi Pro. Revi Pro is, of course, a mixture of prothioconazole and mefentrifluconazole, the 2 azoles together. Again, that's a little bit of a loaded product. I think a full label rate of that gives you a 3/4 dose of prothioconazole and a 1/2 dose of metconazole, so it's kind of a bit more than half plus a half. But again, performing very, very well there, reflecting the activity of its components on the other side. Looking at the eradicant information, actually, when we look at the eradicant information on rhynchosporium, the azoles tend to look slightly stronger than the SDHIs. The SDHIs on the last chart showed how effective they are in the protectant environment, but actually shows the combination of an SDHI azole on rhynchosporium is probably a really good way to go. One offering more protectant, one perhaps a bit more eradicant. And again, Revi Pro actually looking very good there, possibly slightly better than you might have expected given its, the activity of its components. We look at protectant activity over years. Again, it's a similar picture. Miravis coming out really well, very active molecule. Vimoy not far behind it. Intrex, those 3 SDHIs really strong on rhynchosporium. And Proline still doing a decent job for us in there as well. And as we said, Myrisa perhaps not quite as active as the others, but put it with Proline in Revi Pro, it looks very strong. And Apresso in there, well, it contains isoflucipram and Proline, no surprise to see that looking good. And we look at the eradicant information as well over 3 years now, and it broadly sums up what we've just shared. Intrex looking very good there, Miravis and Proline overlying each other, and yeah, I think it's hard to separate those lines based on that information. The mixtures, again, performing very well on the left. Net blotch, I think, is a little bit difficult. It isn't quite as easy to control with something like prothioconazole. As you can see at the top line there, not performing quite as well on net blotch as it used to. Intrex, a little bit better than that. Clearly, though, Miravis is very strong there on net blotch. Myrisa looking quite strong there in the protectant situation as well. I think the Vimoy line is overlying the Myrisa line there, so it too providing very good activity. And the mixture of mefentri plus prothio, yeah, pretty much reflecting what you might expect from that mixture as well. When we look over 2 trials over 2 years on net blotch, in eradicant situations, again, mefentri perhaps not quite as strong in a curative as it is in a protectant situation there, but actually the SDHI is coming out really well there in a more curative net blotch situation. Both Miravis and Vimoy looking very, very strong. And actually, although Proline and Myrisa don't look great, the mixture looks pretty good there in Revi Pro. Looking at ramularia now for a moment, this is the 2025 data from one side. It pretty much reflects what we've seen over a few years now. Miravis is very active on ramularia. Myrisa also pretty good, especially at the higher rates of application. Vimoy certainly had some level of activity on ramularia as well, and Proline also giving us a little bit of useful activity, but not nearly at the same level as what we're seeing from others. When we look over 3 years, that broadly reflects what we saw this year, in that Miravis standing out, looking really good. Yeah, the full label rate, Myrisa isn't that far from it, and yeah, Vimoy and Intrex, they're the 2 SDHIs, clearly giving us something in the order of 50% control on ramularia as well. The mixtures on the left, Revi Pro and Impresso, yeah, I think broadly reflecting the components that are in those mixtures. I mentioned we've got some mildew data, so this is a first actually. I don't think we've shared any barley mildew data for a while. Reassuringly, Proline is really active on powdery mildew. I think probably a lot of agronomists in the room nodding and will know that. But yeah, good to know, even the quarter label rate doing a job at controlling powdery mildew. The SDHI is very active there as well. Miravis and Vimoy are also doing a good job. Myrisa, perhaps not quite as active, but anything above, getting up towards a full label rate, it's doing a good job. And Revi Pro, at a half label rate, doing a good job too. I mentioned rusts as well. This is a bit contrary to what you might expect on wheat brown rust. We actually see Proline really active on barley brown rust, and Miravis actually really active on barley brown. You can't read across from one crop to it's a completely different pathogen. And actually, you'd probably say Proline looks a little stronger than Myrisa there on barley brown rust, which is the opposite of what we'd see on wheat. So yeah, but useful to get that information as well. So to sum up on barley, on rhynchosporium, the DMIs and SDHIs both seem to work very well and work well together. On net blotch, I think the SDHIs are particularly effective. The azoles also adding some good and useful activity. Clearly on ramularia, Miravis gave us the highest level of control. Myrisa still very effective and more effective than prothioconazole. Note, I did share some information on Vimoy on ramularia and powdery mildew. It's not actually registered for use on those. We're sharing that information because you may well be using the product to control rhyncho or net blotch, and you may want to know what it can bring in incidental control on a pathogen. It's not actually on its label. But yes, both on powdery mildew and brown rust, Miravis and Proline giving us a high level of control, and that's great. So I think at this point I'm going to hand over to my colleague Phil Walker to cover the oilseed rape. Over to you, Phil.
Cheers. Philip Walker from AHDB, so oilseed rape researcher. So I'm going to conclude on the fungicide performance series for oilseed rape 2025. So for the oilseed rape series, it's a 4-trial series. So we do 2 trials looking at phoma stem canker, and we locate these in areas where we generally get high leaf pressure phoma leaf spot, and moderate to severe stem cankers depending on the season, the academic of the season. So we had 2 trial sites, so that's Tarrington in Norfolk and Rosemont in Herefordshire, both hosted by AHDB, and we got some good stem canker index results and yield results from those sites for this season. For the light leaf spot trials, we locate these in northern areas where historically we get high pressure of light leaf spot. So we got the High Mothorpe site, so that's North Yorkshire, AHDB hosted site. So we got some good light leaf spot assessment results, severity results, and yield uplift results for that site for this season. The Midlothian site, so that's located near Edinburgh, hosted by SRUC. Fortunately for that site this season, there just wasn't enough of a light leaf spot epidemic to see any valid disease assessment or yield results, so there's nothing to share from that site. So these are the oilseed rape products which we'll be presenting for results included for trials this year, either included in 2025 trials or as part of the over years results. And I will read these out because they generally are a good fair reflection of the range of products available on the market and active ingredients in oilseed rape. And it gives a good sort of indication of actually there is quite a few range of different modes of actions available nowadays, which puts us in a good position compared to where we were, say, 4 or 5 years ago, where there's quite a limited amount of products available. So generally, we've still got azole-based products for oilseed rape, so Proline 275, so prothioconazole, Plover, so difenoconazole, and Toledo tebuconazole. Then got some SDHI-based chemistries, so Boscalid, so Falan, so straight Boscalid. We've got Propulse, which is the fluplyrone prothioconazole coform. And then Aviator 235X Pro, so that's a Bixfen prothioconazole coform, so 2 SDHI-based coforms there. Strobilurins are still quite active on oilseed rape. So we've got 2 plaque-strobin-based chemistries. So that's Architect, so that's plaque-strobin with a PGR element in it, effectively canopy. And then we've got Shepherd, which is a plaque-strobin co-form with bosclid, so the STHI co-form there. And then finally, on the bottom of the list, we've got Prairie Gold there, so that's an oxaloxystrobin plus the azole element, so the difenconazole. There were 2 further products tested in the trials 2025, but these are currently unregistered for use in oilseed rape, so the data on these will be released upon registration. So we start with the trial results for phoma stem canker. So this is the Terrington and Rosemont sites in Norfolk and Herefordshire. So as mentioned, we locate these in areas where we get generally high leaf pressure of phoma leaf spot, which translates itself into the pre-harvest sort of moderate to severe phoma stem cankers depending on the season. So we generally locate these or host them on susceptible varieties, so in this case Resort and Aspirus respectively. And in terms of the phoma leaf spot epidemic this season, we had quite an early epidemic actually. We were seeing the first signs of phoma leaf spot around sort of early October. We got to threshold, the Norfolk site, end of October. We got the T1 spray applied on the 30th of October. Then threshold was a little bit later at the Herefordshire site, about 7-10 days later. So T1 spray was applied on the 8th of November. Well, what we did see at both sites was quite a rapid reinfection period. So we saw reinfection of phoma leaf spot within about 6 weeks of that T1 spray. So the T2 spray was applied in that timing within that 6-week period. And what we saw at that reinfection period was a lot of phoma leaf spot, about essentially 90 to 100% incidence at both sites. So when we came to assess the phoma stem cankers at the pre-harvest stage, we was mostly finding that the phoma stem canker, the lesion itself, was a little bit higher up the root collar. So that generally indicates that a lot of what we're seeing in terms of phoma stem canker lesion infection was a result of that reinfection period. It was a result of that high phoma leaf spotting around that T2 spray timing. So as a result of that, we saw relatively moderate pressures. So Norfolk site, stem canker index of 44, the Herefordshire site, stem canker index of 31. And as we saw, same relative product performance at both sites in terms of stem canker index reduction and yield, as well as the same sort of phoma epidemic. We combined the 2 site results to show the average performance. So this is the disease efficacy charts and the yield charts for the 2 sites combined, so Terrington and Rosemont 2025. So we'll start with the disease severity chart on the left. And just to give some context of what we're looking at, so we've got an untreated average stem canker index of 36. And to give some context of stem canker index, that is essentially a 0 to 100 scale looking at a combination score between incidence and severity. And effectively, what 36 means is, on average, in the untreated control plots, 36% of plants was dead from phoma stem canker. So just over a third of plants dead from phoma stem canker, so a fairly moderate level of infection. And when we saw how the products performed, so in this moderate effective season, those products tested, they all gave a fairly good reduction in phoma stem canker. And we sort of see this trend year on year where we're seeing this maximum level of efficacy at this 50% dose rate. Considering these are 2 spray programs on susceptible varieties, but we're seeing this maximum efficacy at that 50% dose rate with very little or pretty much minimal benefit of increasing that dose rate beyond 50%. So in terms of how the products perform, so that top line there, so that's the straight difenconazole in the plover, so that's given that stem canker index reduction there from 36 down to 15. Below that, 2 products performing quite similarly, so the Proline, so the straight perfluoroconazole, and then that difenconazole oxystrobin co-form in the Prairie Gold. Then you've got 3 products down the bottom there. They've given a sort of high level of efficacy against phoma stem canker. So 2 SGHI-based chemistry, so the Propulse, so the fluplairon co-form, and then the straight boscid in the Falan. And then the very bottom line is the plaque-strobin-based chemistry, the Architect. When we look at the yield uplifts, so we go from an untreated yield of 4.3 tons per hectare there. And similarly to disease efficacy charts, we're seeing pretty much that maximum yield uplift, considering as well 2 spray programs and susceptible varieties, that maximum yield uplift at that 50% dose rate. If you're seeing any increase in yield from increasing dose beyond 50%, it's only really going up in increments of, say, 0.05 tonnes per hectare. So we're very much seeing that maximum at that 50% dose, and it's a general year-on-year trend that we see in phoma stem canker trials. I will read these dose responses out because I know in oilseed rape we're very much dealing with dose responses around 0.1 tonnes per hectare, and separations of that can give quite considerable differences in gross margins. As we see a bit of product separation at that 75% dose, I'll just read these out at that 75% dose. So the bottom line there, so that's the plover, so that's given a 0.15 tonnes per hectare yield uplift over untreated control. Next is Falan, 0.2 tonnes per hectare. The straight prothioconazole and the Proline 275, that's 0.25 tonnes per hectare. You then got the Prairie Gold, so that's oxystrobin difenconazole coform, 0.35 tonnes per hectare. Top line there, the Propulse, so the fluplyrine coform, so that's given a 0.45 tonnes per hectare. And just above that, that's the Architects, that plaxidrobin-based chemistry, that's given a 0.5 tonnes per hectare yield uplift over control. But note, that is at that 75% dose rate. At that 50% dose rate, that's given that same 0.45 tonnes per hectare yield uplift in comparison to that Propulse. So we'll move on to the over years results for phoma stem canker and yield. So this now encompasses 10 years worth of trials from 2015 to 2025, encompassing 18 trials. And the benefit of these over years trial sets is essentially it shows the average product performance taking into account of seasons where we have high disease pressure and seasons where we get moderate disease pressure as well. So we very much get an average level performance of those products considering those differing pressure seasons. So we'll start with the disease control chart on the left. So just to give, again, context on the stem canker index. So we're going for a stem canker index there of 45. So essentially 45% of the untreated plants dead from phoma stem canker. And normally when we're looking at the phoma stem canker charts, where we're looking at these moderate to severe levels of pressure, we generally say we get stem canker index reduction of 30 and below. That's really where you normally see an economic yield uplift of applying that fungicide. Just to quickly note, before I go through the products, on the product inclusion in this trial series. So the Toledo, so straight tebuconazole, that is based on limited data because that was only included in 1 year in that trial set. The Proline 275, the prothioconazole, that's been in every trial since 2015 as a standard, and all other products have been included for at least 3 years. So we go from that top line there, so that's the Toledo, again, based on limited data, so the straight tebuconazole. So it's given some reduction there, phoma stem canker, but it has been limited and it has been at a lower level of efficacy compared to the other azole-based products tested within the trial series. So we take the next line down there, so that's the plover, so the difenconazole, so that's given that stem canker index reduction from 45 to 20. Two products below, similar level of reduction, so about stem canker index reduction 15 to 17, so that's that Prairie Gold, oxystrobin coform, and the Proline 275, so the straight prothioconazole. Below that, stem canker index reduction to around 12, so that's those two SGXI products, so the Falan, straight boscalid, and the Propulse, the fluplyrine coform. Then at the bottom of the chart, you've got 3 products there, it's given a high level of efficacy against phoma stem canker, so that's those 2 plaxidrobin-based chemistries. So the Architect and the Shepherd being the coform with the boscalid, and then you've got Aviator there within that also given a high level of efficacy, that being the SDHI bixafen plus prothioconazole coform. Similarly to what we saw with the single year results for 2025, over years we're very much seeing these maximum efficacy of the products at that 50% dose rate, and same for the yield uplift. Also, but do consider these are part 2 spray programs which would be applied on what would be considered susceptible varieties. So in terms of yield uplift, so very much seeing that maximum at that 50% dose. We do see a little bit of product separation at 75% dose, so I'll just read these out quickly at that 75% dose rate. So bottom line there, so it's Toledo, so the straight tebuconazole, that's given a 0.15 tonnes per hectare yield uplift. Got the Falan and the Plover, they've given a 0.3 tonnes per hectare yield uplift. The Proline and the Prairie Gold, 0.4 tonnes per hectare yield uplift. 3 products above that, given a 0.45 tonnes per hectare yield uplift. So that's the Architect, the Shepherd, so those 2 plaque-strone-based chemistries, and then the fluplauran coform in the Propulse. Then the top line, just above that, given 0.5 tonnes per hectare yield uplift, that's the Aviator, so that Bixfen coform. But do note, that is at that 75% dose, at that 50% dose rate. That product's given that same 0.45 tonnes per hectare yield uplift compared to those other 3 top yielding products. So we move on to light leaf spot. So this is the light leaf spot trials results for High Mothorpe, so North Yorkshire, where, as mentioned, historically we get high pressure of light leaf spot. And I will give some context of what we mean by high pressure of light leaf spot, because I know in previous years there's been a bit of confusion around what we mean by high pressure when we talk about moderate leaf severity. So we have high pressure at these sites because we got a high instance of light leaf spot, instance being the number or percentage of plants infected. So in the untreated control for this season, we have 70% of plants infected with light leaf spot. So essentially 7 out of 10 plants had symptoms of light leaf spot. So a high level of disease, high instance, so a high pressure. But when we evaluate how the products have performed against light leaf spot, we generally evaluate for the severity being the coverage of light leaf spot on the leaf layers on the individual plants. Because we know through these evaluation trials that we see quite a strong correlation between leaf severity and reduction in yield, and we also see a good correlation between reducing that amount of leaf severity for the use of fungicides and seeing the yield benefit, the increase in yield. When we look at the charts and talk about moderate leaf pressure, we've got to put it in the context of when we are assessing these plants as well. So we're assessing them at later growth stages. Generally, we're assessing after stem extension. We're normally assessing sort of either at the start of the flowering period or over the flowering period when the plant's reached its full growth and it's got its full leaf layer out. And it can have around 20 active leaves at this time. So when we're showing the results for these, we're essentially showing the average level of coverage of light leaf spot over that whole leaf canopy, which effectively gives a moderate score. But as we know from doing these evaluation trials, you don't particularly need, in these high pressure situations, a high level of light leaf spot severity coverage on average across that whole leaf layer to see some quite significant impacts on yield. And I'll go through some of the other effects of sort of light leaf spot and what we mean for our efficacy when we go into the disease charts. Also, to give some idea of what we do with spray timings on these trials, so we try and target the spray timings to essentially match or meet the start of the light leaf spot epidemic. So light leaf spot has a latent phase. It has an infected period where essentially it infects within the leaf tissue and it's non-visible. It's effectively developing in the leaf tissue before it erupts on the leaf surface. And that phase is generally over the autumn-winter period. So we try and monitor the plots so we can determine when that latent period infection starts over the autumn-winter period to target that T1 spray timing response to that. And we mainly do that, we do that by, in fact, we visit the trials. Each week we collect untreated plant samples. We bring these back to effectively the office. We put them in poly bags. We allow them to incubate at ambient temperature a couple of days to effectively allow that latent infection to accelerate itself and to sporulate and come to the leaf surface. So when we identify that timing when that latent period infection has started over that autumn-winter period, that's when we target that T1 spray timing. And for this season at this site, it was at end of November. The T2 spray timing, we try and target that for when the light leaf spot starts readily sporulating in the trial plots in the spring, in the untreated trial plots. So essentially, that's the spring spray timing, which looks to provide a protective coverage of fungicide over the leaf layer to stop that early sporulation from effectively translocating itself up the leaf canopy and spreading from plant to plant. And then for this season, that happened at the end of March. So 2 well-timed spray timings, 2 well-timed fungicide applications in response to the leaf epidemic. Now, normally when we evaluate products for fungicide performance and how they respond to the light leaf spot, we're normally looking at evaluating them around 4 to 6 weeks after that T2 spray timing, because that's when we normally see the maximum level of efficacy of the fungicide applied. For this season, conditions in April, generally they just weren't conductive for light leaf spot sporulation. They were quite dry. They're actually quite cool up in North Yorkshire. They were below 10 degrees on average. And light leaf spot normally likes temperatures around 15, 16 degrees as its optimum for it to get sporulating and get moving. So it weren't until we was getting into sort of May, over the flowering period, when we started getting a little bit of rain splash to move that light leaf spot infection on the leaf canopy, a bit more ambient temperatures, that we started getting more sporulation light leaf spot, and we was getting accessible levels of light leaf spot. So we did 2 assessments over that period, one in early May, one at the end of May, where we were seeing quite moderate levels of severity. So first assessment, on average, across that whole leaf canopy, we've seen about 3% severity. Second assessment timing, seeing just over 4% severity. And as we were seeing the same relative level of light leaf spot, we saw the same sort of relative level of fungicide performance at both those spray timings. We've combined both those assessment results to essentially give the average performance of how those products performed over essentially the whole of that flowering period. It also gives a good indication of fungicide persistence as well, considering those assessments took place 6 to 8 weeks after that T2 spray timing. So following that bit of background, I'll go into the efficacy chart. So we start with the untreated control. So as mentioned, average across essentially the whole of that leaf canopy on a fully grown oilseed rape plant, we were seeing 3.6% severity of light leaf spot. We've got high pressure, over 70% of plants infected by light leaf spot. We also have to consider that there are some individual leaf layers within that assessments. We did have quite a high level of light leaf spot severity as well, so it's very much the average across that whole of the canopy. And what you might consider when you look at these charts is you might look at them and effectively think, well, you're seeing a 50 to 60% reduction there from fungicides applied. But what you also got to consider with light leaf spot is that 50 to 60% reduction in light leaf spot severity seen is very much what you're seeing on the leaf surface. That's the reduction in the active sporulation that you're seeing. Light leaf spot as a disease, as mentioned, it has a lot of latent, non-visible effects on the plant. So it has latent infection within the leaf tissue. It can have microsporulation on the leaf surface, which is not visible to the naked eye. It can have latent infection within the stem tissue. It also has a lot of physiological effects as well, so it can cause leaf distortion, can cause stem distortion, it can cause sort of interruptions to metabolic pathways within the plant tissues. If you have infection around when the flowering buds are forming, it can cause distortion of the flowering buds, and they don't quite form to their full potential. Later in the season, you can get pod distortion as a result of the earlier leaf infection, which again reduces yield. So even though what you're seeing on the surface is that 50 to 60% reduction, you're actually seeing a lot of the yield benefit because you're getting a lot of that protection against those latent sort of infective events, those non-visible latent sort of infections that light leaf spot can form. So in terms of how the products have performed, so as mentioned, high pressure situation. So we're very much thinking of the maximum level of efficacy of the fungicide applied. We're also thinking a bit of fungicide persistence here as well, because in fact these were evaluated 6 to 8 weeks after that T2 spray. So really we're seeing that maximum level of efficacy in this situation at that 75% dose. And all those products, they've given the same relative level of performance. So that top line there being flange, straight bosclid, that's given around a 48% efficacy. Bottom line there, the Architect, the plaquestrone-based chemistry, that's given around a 59-60% efficacy. And those two prothioconazole-based products, so the Proline 275 and the Propulse, the fluplime coform, they've given around a 54-55% level of efficacy. Just to quickly note on the Flan, actually, Flan doesn't actually have a direct label recommendation for light leaf spot, but it could be used at similar spray timings for other diseases, so we're very much just looking at secondary effects of that specific chemistry. But all those other chemistries do have a direct label recommendation for light leaf spot. We do also include a timing treatment in these trials, so this is the chart in the top right-hand corner. So the timing treatment being effectively untreated in the autumn/winter spray timing, followed by one treatment in the spring, half full rate Proline, and then the other way round, so half full rate Proline once in the autumn, followed by untreated in the spring. So the concept of including timing treatment is we can evaluate which of those 2 spray timings, the T1 to T2, gave the biggest contribution to light leaf spot reduction and yield uplift in response to the epidemic. And then, as we saw in this season, we had 2 well-timed spray applications in response to the epidemic. So generally, both those spray timings have given an equal level of reduction in light leaf spot, which means effectively the levels of control you're seeing in the chart is a combination of both those spray timings. So just finally, moving on to yield uplift. So untreated yield there, 5.5 tonnes per hectare. And then, yep, from those products tested, we have seen some strong yield uplift. So as mentioned, even though we've seen on that surface level of light leaf spot reduction, that 50 to 60% reduction, because of those latent non-visible effects that you're getting from the fungicide for light leaf spot sort of control and protection, you are seeing these strong yield uplifts. So if you just go from that 75% dose, where if you're thinking about fungicide persistence maximum efficacy and the fungicide persistence for those late spray timings. So yeah, generally the yields, they're quite close to each other, all those products. There's not a huge amount of separation. So that bottom line there, the Architect, so that's given around a 0.35 tonnes per hectare yield uplift. The Flan, 0.4, Proline 275, so the propiconazole 0.42. Then that top line there, so that's the SGHI co-form, so the fluorogram with the propiconazole. You've seen a minor benefit there of having a SGHI co-form, a mixed partner, so that's given a 0.45 tonnes per hectare yield uplift, yeah. Again, if you look at the timing treatment, so yeah, so like the disease efficacy charts, both those spray timings, they've given the same relative contribution to yield uplift, and that is important to consider when we're thinking of those spray timings, we're particularly thinking of that autumn-winter spray timing, when you're applying very much over that latent period when you've not got visible infection, but you're applying the protective fungicide over that leaf layer to protect against that latent infection. That's building up a yield potential, which you then targeting a second application in that spring to effectively put another protected layer on to protect against that sporulating stage, which is carrying on that yield potential built up from the autumn applied timing through to harvest. Perfect. So just to summarise on oilseed rape, so 5% canker, yep, so we've got effective azoles, non-azoles options. Yield responses for this season, so part of 2 spray programs on septal varieties, we effectively saw 0.15 to 0.5 tonnes per hectare, and very much seeing that maximum efficacy at that 50% dose rate. Light leaf spot, got azoles, non-azoles, and co-formulations. They've all shown to be effective. They've all given a similar level of reduction in light leaf spot severity and a similar uplift in yield, but it's very much that timing of application that's been important. So that timing of application in response to the epidemic, considering essentially that autumn applied timing, autumn late winter or early winter applied timing for that sort of that latent infection, and then that spring applied timing to try and get that protective leaf layer on when the light leaf spot starts sporulating. Slow attenuation stem rot, we haven't covered these today, but there is a range of modes of actions available, and you can find the historic charts for fungicide performance searches stem rot on the AHDB website on the Knowledge Library. Yeah, so generally just want to conclude with acknowledgements. So very much thanks to Georgia Baxter and Catherine Harris, AHDB, very much run the fungicide performance program. And then all our project partners at ADAS, NIAB, SOUC, Harper Adams University and Sugarts over in Ireland, as well as the sort of trials organisations and the trials teams for each of these respective organisations who very much put a lot of hard work and effort in managing these trials and producing the results that we've shown today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone.
Or Phil. Got one in the middle.
Come out of the way. Come out of the way.
Yeah, oh yeah, maybe
at the
not.
mic.
Thank you. Oh, it should turn on, is that? There you go.
On now. Yeah. This is for Phil on the considering that you use the same chemicals to control both of the two diseases.
Yeah.
Do you actually assess the trials for the other disease? I mean, I know that as a farmer, it probably doesn't matter that the information's conflated, but you know, from a scientific point of view, it might.
Yeah, we do if it's visible. All diseases which are there, we do assess. In terms of the light leaf spot trial, effectively, we use campus, which is about where it was traditionally a 6 and 6 for both diseases. So the idea being that we should get light leaf spot, but we should have some resistance against phoma stem canker. And we've got it in North Yorkshire, where we don't quite get the degree days for the phoma stem canker to form to the full stem cankers, so we have to assess the whole trial. So we do get the phoma leaf spotting, but we don't get the phoma stem canker. That effectively means we have to then evaluate the same products against phoma stem canker. But if we do see other diseases in the trial, we will assess for them, and if there is attributable results for both, then we will show those.
I know that down diseases. Here we only get a light leaf spot year once in 20, but still it's interesting to know that you are actually looking for the other one. Yeah.
And generally, as a program, as a fungicide control program, I mean, it is a bit difficult because you're getting slightly different phases of the epidemic of the disease. So you can get phoma leaf spotting coming a bit earlier compared to light leaf spot, but depending on when you've got your fungicide time to go on for your phoma leaf spot, you are getting some protective coverage, leaf layer coverage against the light leaf spot as well. So you can sort of almost match your spray timings depending on when the epidemic starts and depending on your history and your location in the country to historically how much pressure you're going to get from those two different diseases.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? Oh, got one at the back.
Jonathan, there was much debate this year that in a very low disease year, was it going to be worth spending money on using the most up-to-date chemistry? So should you go back to the old chemistry or just use lower rates but stick with the most modern chemistry? What's your view of it? Have your trials answered that question?
Another tough question from you there, John. I mean, I think the trap we often fall into is using old chemistry and using chemistry that was very effective 2 or 3 years ago. We used it back then. It seems to work. And I think we have to move with the times a bit, and sometimes the newer chemistry has a higher level of activity. And if we can use those at lower rates where we've got lower pressure, that's probably what's going to give you better efficacy and possibly better cost effectiveness in terms of control. So probably more on the side of using chemistry that's effective, but perhaps at lower rates.
Brilliant. So if we could just thank Jonathan for that.